Vittorio Veneto was the second vessel in what is commonly known as the Littorio class of Italian battleships. She was built under the watchful gaze of the Regia Marina, Italy's Royal Navy, during the tumult of World War II. Her story began in October 1934, when her keel was laid with grand ambitions. By July 1937, onlookers applauded her dramatic launch into the water, and by August 1940, she was officially readied for the Italian fleet. Vittorio Veneto took her name from Italy's victorious Battle of Vittorio Veneto in World War I, a symbolic tribute to national pride. This massive warship had three sisters, Littorio, Roma, and Impero, though only Littorio and Roma managed to become fully operational in time to see extensive action. To project power, Vittorio Veneto relied on 9 formidable 15-inch guns mounted in 3 triple turrets. Paired with a top cruising speed of about 30 knots, roughly 35 miles per hour, she stood as a modern testament to Italian shipbuilding prowess. From the outset, Vittorio Veneto stood front and center in many of Italy's key naval undertakings. When the British carried out their daring air raid on the harbor at Taranto in November 1940, Vittorio Veneto miraculously escaped damage. Soon after, she took part in pivotal engagements such as the Battle of Cape Spartivento in November 1940 and the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941. During the latter conflict, she endured a torpedo bomber strike that forced her into temporary repairs. Later that same year, the British submarine HMS Urge scored a torpedo hit on her in December 1941. Despite these blows, the battleship pressed on, venturing out repeatedly to threaten Allied convoys bound for Malta. Unfortunately for the Regia Marina, severe fuel shortages in 1941 and early 1942 drastically curtailed large-scale missions. By September 1943, Italy withdrew from the war, and Vittorio Veneto found herself among the fleet units surrendered to the Allies. For the next 3 years, she spent a kind of limbo under British supervision in Egypt. After the war, the once proud vessel was handed over to Britain as a war prize and was eventually dismantled. Description and key specifications. Vittorio Veneto's overall length measured around 780 feet, with a beam of about 108 feet and a draft nearing 31.5 feet. These dimensions took her past the limit set by the Washington Naval Treaty, which was meant to cap battleship displacement at 35,000 long tons. Instead, Vittorio Veneto exceeded 40,000 long tons in standard load, and with full combat supplies, she weighed in at more than 45,000 long tons. Power came from 4 Beluzzo-geared steam turbines, collectively rated at an impressive 128,000 shaft horsepower. Steam was generated by 8 oil-fired Yarrow boilers. Pushing this immense battleship through the waves required a powertrain robust enough to achieve about 30 knots, equivalent to roughly 35 miles per hour, giving her a respectable operating range of nearly 3,920 miles, at a more conservative speed of 20 knots. Typically, her crew numbered between 1,830 and 1,950 officers and sailors. The ship's main battery was a source of immense pride. 9 15-inch guns divided among 3 triple turrets. 2 of those turrets sat forward, layered so that one towered above the other, while the third was positioned at the rear. For secondary armament, Vittorio Veneto carried 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, placed at each corner of the superstructure to guard against smaller warships. Additional older guns, 4 4.7-inch pieces, were intended to fire illuminating star shells. Her anti-aircraft arsenal consisted of 12 3-inch guns in single mounts, backed by 20 37mm guns and 16 20mm guns. By July 1943, Vittorio Veneto had been outfitted with an EC-3 Targufo radar system. This cutting-edge, for its time, equipment could detect surface vessels about 19 miles away and spot aircraft up to 50 miles out. In an era when radar was still relatively novel, this gave the battleship a technological edge over some of her earlier adversaries. Regarding armor, the ship wore an 11-inch main belt across her most critical sections. A supplemental steel layer of nearly 3 inches added further protection. Her main deck armor thickness varied between 6 inches in vital areas and less than 2 inches in sections considered less at risk. Each of the main gun turrets carried 14-inch thick faces, while the conning tower was outfitted with 10-inch thick sides to safeguard senior officers directing combat operations. Like many capital ships of her era, Vittorio Veneto also featured a catapult for launching reconnaissance float planes, such as the IMAMRO 43 or the Regione 2000 fighter bomber, in a float plane configuration. Early service and construction. Ordered as part of the 1934 shipbuilding program, Vittorio Veneto was deliberately named after Italy's pivotal triumph over Austria-Hungary in late 1918. On the same day her keel was laid, October 28, 1934, her sister Littorio began taking shape at another site. Although she officially launched on July 25, 1937, difficulties securing sufficient heavy armor delayed construction. By October 1939, major aspects of her hull and superstructure were ready, but it took additional months of design revisions to finalize her. In early October 1939, Vittorio Veneto relocated to Venice for a bottom cleaning, since Trieste lacked a dry dock large enough for the job. Trials got underway later that month and tested everything from propulsion to the formidable main guns. By April 28, 1940, she was delivered, but final touches continued through May. On May 6th, her massive 15-inch shells were loaded aboard in Taranto, preparing her to stand tall in the 9th Division of the Italian fleet. In June 1940, Italy joined the war against Britain and France, although Vittorio Veneto only became fully operational by early August. World War II engagements, early sorties and Taranto raid. Late August to early September 1940 saw Vittorio Veneto embark with 4 fellow battleships, 10 cruisers and 34 destroyers, intending to intercept British naval forces. However, a lack of solid aerial reconnaissance led to unsuccessful hunts. Time and again, the Regione struggled to corner Allied convoys, especially once British scouting alerted their vessels to the looming Italian threat. The night of November 10th to 11th, 1940, brought the daring British air assault on Taranto. 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers, launched from HMS Illustrious, tore across the sky in 2 waves. Although Vittorio Veneto emerged unscathed, other battleships took severe hits. After that surprise, Vittorio Veneto led the fleet to Naples, where she became the flagship under Admiral Inigo Campioni. Battle of Cape Spartivento. In mid-November, Vittorio Veneto and Giulio Cesare tried and failed to catch British convoys heading for Malta. On November 26, 1940, in an engagement known by the British as the Battle of Cape Spartivento, Vittorio Veneto steamed out with Giulio Cesare, 6 cruisers and 14 destroyers. They intended to ambush a convoy protected by the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, battleship Ramillies, and battlecruiser Renown. Initial Italian reconnaissance exaggerated the British strength, prompting Campioni to be cautious. Vittorio Veneto did exchange fire with British cruisers at nearly 17 miles, an astonishing distance for gunnery in that era, and managed to slightly damage HMS Manchester. However, the looming threat of British torpedo bombers convinced the Italian admiral to withdraw. Multiple air assaults on Naples afterward led the Italian command to shuffle the fleet around, hoping to preserve its remaining battleships, shifting to La Spezia and further actions. By January 8, 1941, Vittorio Veneto was the sole operational battleship of her class, moving between Naples and La Spezia to sidestep British air raids. With her sister ships under repair, she took on a critical role in the Regia Marina's attempts to disrupt British shipping. By late February, Giulio Cesare and Andrea Doria rejoined the effort, but their combined sorties failed to bring a decisive engagement against the British, who frequently broke contact or evaded detection. The Battle of Cape Matapan. Perhaps Vittorio Veneto's most famous encounter occurred in late March 1941. She headed a force of 8 cruisers and 9 destroyers, poised to strike British shipping near Greece. The Regia Aeronautica and German Fliegerkorps X offered air support. The Italians first ran into the British 15th Cruiser Squadron. Vittorio Veneto opened fire, but the British cruisers swiftly maneuvered away, aided by smoke and the Italian battleship's momentary gunnery misfires. Worse was to come. British carrier HMS Formidable launched torpedo bombers, forcing Vittorio Veneto to execute evasive maneuvers. Though she dodged those torpedoes, the attacks kept her occupied long enough that Admiral Iaquino ordered a retreat. Subsequent airstrikes caught up with her, and around 3:10 p.m., a torpedo struck her port side. The impact sheared off her portside propeller, messed up the rudder, and caused about 4,000 long tons of water to flood in. Struggling with steering and losing speed, Vittorio Veneto temporarily stopped. British bombers added more damage with near-miss hits to her stern. Her crew's frantic damage control efforts slowly stabilized the vessel, letting her limp away under her starboard shafts at about 20 knots. Another wave of swordfish torpedo bombers inflicted a fatal blow on the heavy cruiser Pola, leaving her dead in the water. In the nighttime confusion, Pola and 2 other cruisers plus 2 destroyers were ambushed by British battleships and destroyed. Vittorio Veneto reached Taranto on March 29, 1941, for repairs lasting until July, and she wasn't fully ready for action again until August. Later operations and submarine attack. Come August 22 to 25, 1941, Vittorio Veneto and Littorio sailed in an unsuccessful effort to intercept a British operation aimed at mining Livorno and attacking Sardinia. A month later, on September 27th, she again led a force to disrupt a British convoy in what was called Operation Halberd. Despite significant strength on both sides, neither force successfully closed for battle, though the battleship Nelson was torpedoed by Italian aircraft. By mid-December, Vittorio Veneto's attempts to safeguard or threaten convoys continued. Yet, on December 14th, as she was returning from an aborted convoy mission, the British submarine HMS Urge fired 3 torpedoes at her in the Straits of Messina. One torpedo found its mark, ripping a hole about 43 feet long in her side. Despite water flooding in, the ship's Pugliese torpedo defense system limited the damage enough for her to steam back to port on her own power. She headed to Taranto once more for repairs. Action in 1942 and beyond. In June 1942, with her repairs complete, Vittorio Veneto joined Littorio, 4 cruisers, and a dozen destroyers to intercept Operation Vigorous, a British convoy sailing from Alexandria to Malta. British aircraft, including Wellington and Bristol Beaufort bombers, launched repeated assaults. Though Vittorio Veneto avoided direct hits, the cruiser Trento was crippled and sunk by a British submarine, and Littorio endured some damage. Facing the threat of more British attacks, Admiral Iaquino called off the chase. The convoy ultimately returned to Alexandria, failing to reach Malta. In November 1942, Vittorio Veneto moved to Naples to help counter the Allied landings in North Africa. While en route, the British submarine HMS Umbra attempted an attack but missed. Another bombing raid in December convinced the Italians to shift remaining battleships to La Spezia, where Vittorio Veneto stayed for the better part of Italy's active service in World War II. By June 5, 1943, Allied bombers severely damaged Vittorio Veneto's bow with 2 large bombs while she was anchored in La Spezia. One bomb passed entirely through her hull and detonated beneath, compromising the ship's structural integrity so severely that she had to be transferred to Genoa for more comprehensive repairs. Armistice and final fate. On September 3, 1943, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. Just 6 days later, Vittorio Veneto led a column of Italian warships toward Malta to be interned, effectively signaling the end of her combat career. En route, the German Air Force attacked using Dornier Do-217s, fitted with Fritz X guided bombs. Littorio, by then renamed Italia, suffered a damaging strike, and the battleship Roma was sunk. Vittorio Veneto emerged unscathed from that onslaught, but continued on to surrender. She then spent time in Malta until mid-September, and soon after was moved to Alexandria, Egypt, finally ending up in the Great Bitter Lake in the Suez Canal. There she remained until October 6, 1946, when she received permission to return to Italy. After a brief stop in Augusta, Sicily, she arrived in La Spezia on October 14th. The peace treaty signed in February 1947 designated Vittorio Veneto as a war prize for Britain. She was officially taken off the Naval Register at the start of 1948, and broken up for scrap soon thereafter. Through it all, Vittorio Veneto logged 11 offensive operations, making her the busiest Italian battleship of World War II. Her guns even found a second life, at least in part. A group of 12 3.5-inch anti-aircraft weapons were removed and eventually found their way to the Yugoslav People's Army. They were installed on the island of Giria, playing an unexpected role decades later in the Croatian War of Independence. Legacy and reflection. Vittorio Veneto's career, from her ambitious beginnings in the mid-1930s to her forced decommissioning in the late 1940s, highlights the monumental shift in naval warfare during World War II. Once considered among the world's most advanced battleships, she ultimately encountered the harsh realities of evolving aerial tactics and the unstoppable march of technological innovation. With each near miss and torpedo strike, the vulnerabilities of massive capital ships became more evident. Yet Vittorio Veneto also embodied the resilience and determination of her crew, who struggled valiantly to keep her afloat through countless challenges. Her repeated returns to port for repairs, after what might have been catastrophic damage for lesser vessels, cemented her reputation as a robust adversary. Even when resources dwindled and the tides of war turned against Italy, Vittorio Veneto's presence on the open sea demanded respect from friend and foe alike. Her story ends with the irony of her once majestic hull broken down for scrap under British ownership, a stark reminder of how fortunes can change in the grand theater of global conflict. The guns that once threatened Allied convoys in the Mediterranean found new purpose on a different battlefield decades later. Such a legacy underscores that in the ever-shifting world of wartime technology and alliances, no warship's fate is ever truly predictable.